And I'm the director of Ginn Library here at the Fletcher School. I am delighted to welcome back Patrick Kabanda to Fletcher for this book talk. When I was first starting, Patrick was a student, so it's a big treat actually to have you back. So just a few logistics. We're going to have the book talk for about an hour, followed by book signing in the lobby area. There's more refreshments for us to have. Patrick will stay for a little bit and chat with us all as well. But we did sell out of books, and so if you have books, that would be great. Patrick will sign. We have one more for sale that we're displaying here. But the bookstore will be carrying other books too at a later time if you wanted to buy the book. If you're not able to get a copy for while you're here today.
You're gonna have one of mine for $100.
Oh, $100 is the asking price.
I'll bid $150.
Going once. So actually, Professor Jess Selacuse is going to come up and introduce Patrick and say a few words about Patrick while he was a student here. And so thank you again for coming.
This is a real privilege to be able to welcome back Patrick and to introduce him to you because he has written really an extraordinary book on a topic with a perspective that very few people have taken on development. I met Patrick in, I think it was probably August of 2011, when he took my course on law and development, which I'm teaching here at the Fletcher School. And I think I remember our conversation after the first class. He came up to me and said, you know, I think I want to write a paper on development, but I want to talk about the role of the arts and music in development. And I thought that's a very interesting idea because so much of the literature on development just focuses on economics. And what Patrick saw, and I think Patrick's one is absolutely right, is that we're not all economic animals. We are cultural animals and creative animals. And that's what he wanted to look at. So he wrote an excellent paper, and I like to think, and I'm flattering myself that this book has its origin in that course some 8 years ago. But it is truly, I think, a great achievement. It is superbly researched. It is cogently argued. After Patrick left the Fletcher School, he worked with the World Bank, again taking this idea of his that, and this is the other thing I really admire about his work and his personality is he strikes out on original courses and gets very original results. This is, the arts, of course, you should know, are not purely theoretical for Patrick. He's a superb musician, trained at the Juilliard School of Music. And I remember, Patrick, your one concert that you gave in the Goddard Chapel, where I think you gave that organ a working out that it has never seen since. So we don't know what you're going to do after this. All of us here at the Fletcher School will be watching. And we want to thank you for coming back and sharing the results of your stupendous work. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to turn the platform over to Patrick Kabanda. And I guess I should introduce you. That wasn't part of my mandate. But our dean ad interim is here with us, and Ian is John Stone, and most of you know him, and he and Patrick are going to engage in a conversation about the book.
Yeah. Thanks, Jess.
Thank you.
Which one? You choose.
Let me take the
You got that one? Yes. I'll be looking into the sun. Yes. So thank you for this opportunity, Patrick. And I don't think I get any credit for inspiring your ideas in the book, although we worked together when you were a student.
Yes.
But why don't you just say a couple of words to begin, and then I've got some questions for you. But let me give you a couple of minutes just to say hello to everyone.
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you all for coming. I know it snowed a little bit, and for spreading wherever you came. Some people came as far as Lawrence, Andover, Methuen, anyone from New York. Anyway, thank you for making the trip to be here. And of course, for these two professors, senior professors, very busy, and I want to thank you, Dean Johnston, for making the time. What you were not told, he was my academic advisor when I was here. And of course, Professor Salakos, thank you very much for having me here. What Professor Salakos did not tell you is that he kicked out my proposal 3 times. So this is bullshit, go. Try again. And thankfully I was raised in Africa where we're not always told you are great. So it made me work, and I think one last, the third time is like you're running out of time because the semester is about to end. Why don't you go to the library and ask for help? And all don't want to ask for help, but I had to swallow my pride. So I went to the library and asked for help, and Professor Salakos said, go and ask them that you want basic literature on the arts and the law and economic development in Africa. So I went down to the library, which is sponsoring this talk, and I met one of our reference to librarians, Miriam Zelsa. She's somewhere here. And Miriam went and did the research, and somehow she found all these amazing papers. And guess what came up first was Amartya Sen. So Amartya Sen's work came up first because he's been thinking about these issues for a long time. And Joe Salakos had already assigned development as freedom as a required reading for my class. So that really got me interested in this. And when I went and read Sen's work, I'm like, if Professor Salakos says that this doesn't make sense, I can't write this paper. And thankfully, the first time, I think when I went back with a framework from Sen's, like, yeah, this is great. Now sit down and write the paper. So I wrote a paper. And actually, talking of thanking people, I want to thank Chie. Chie right there is representing Amartya Sen, who is in India. But she's his assistant, and she's kept up with all our exchanges, reading long emails and manuscripts and things like that. So thank you, Chie, for your help and for coming. And of course, there are many people. I see my former organ student, Doug, here, and his wife, Linda. Many of you, a colleague from Andover, Carol Perry, my host here, Nick Danforth. There are many people, my professor here, Professor Simon, and marketing. So thank you so much. And many, many friends. I know I have friends from Andover who are also here. I won't mention names, but also Cindy. Thank you so much for putting up with this. She's been back and forth trying to make sure that this is done. So I want to thank you all for making the time here, and I think now we should turn to the real conversation here after the word of thanks or song of thanks. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Patrick, and wonderful to see so many friends and admirers here. So, first question. This book brings together 2 of your passions.
Yes.
Music, international relations, specifically development. Just start by telling us a little bit about what those 2 passions mean to you and how they came together and when they came together.
So music and international relations.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I know the first story is that I grew up in Uganda. If you have had a chance to look at the book, I say how I grew up in 2 worlds. And one world was the world of music, where there was always joy with music. And the other world was Idi Amin was president then. And I think, I don't want to bring in politics, but you see in current affairs, political all over the world, things are not going very well. And if you're living in an oppressive regime like we had back then, or even many countries it's still the case, to some of us music was a refuge, where you could go and play music and feel like at least you get a break. And so that was really the first encounter. I saw that music is very powerful in trying to at least give human beings a break and bring some joy to people's lives. And this has been cited and even practiced all over the world. Now, I was lucky when I was in Uganda. I got a scholarship to come to the United States, and I went to a school called Brevard College in North Carolina. When I was there, someone who had me in Uganda on the yoga and said, no, you have to go to Juilliard School. And I asked people, where is Juilliard School? And everyone was like, Juilliard? Oh, if you're not people like you might forget it. Anyway, I tried going to different schools. Ironically, all my first choices, I never got in or never got money. Juilliard gave me a full scholarship. So I go to Juilliard. What do I find? Fletcher is everywhere. Do you all know about the Fletcher Mafia? Well, the president of Juilliard went to Fletcher. So during the first orientation, I was there sitting in the front listening, and the president of Julia said, I am Joseph Police. I went to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and I'm now really here at the Julia School, and we're trying to see, not just to get to train you to be wonderful performers, also see what is the role of the arts in people's lives, and also civic engagement. So in fact, Joseph Police himself has written a book called The Artist as Citizen. That's where my sort of engagement started, and I started researching the Fletcher School. I saw it was a remarkable school with a lot of distinguished diplomats and done a lot of work. So I came here to teach a little bit at Phillips Academy in Andover, where some of our colleagues here are coming from. And then I applied to many schools. I got into some. Fletcher is one of the places I was lucky to get in. And when I got here, I'm like, I'm not going to forget my music. Because some friends were like, oh, now you can just go do something more practical. But I'm like, I'm going to still write about music, or at least study that area. And that's why when I showed up in Professor Salko's class, I'm like, I want to write a paper looking at the arts and intellectual property. So pretty much my training at the Fletcher School gave me an opportunity, because the curriculum is interdisciplinary. I was able to create courses which really reflected in this book. If it wasn't Fletcher, if I didn't come to Fletcher, I don't think I'll have written this course, because even people like Amartya Sen, who I knew a little bit, but if you didn't assign development as film, I don't think I would have dug in that much. So pretty much that's the roadmap.
Yeah, yeah, good. Yeah. And the sort of combination of these two passions of yours actually come out in the structure of the book and some of the language of the book. So for those of you who have not read it, instead of an introduction, there's an overture. Part 3 is called Trade in Services, a 3-part suite. Instead of the conclusion, there's a finale. And there's all sorts of phrases throughout the book. I think you describe Adam Smith as the composer of A Wealth of Nations.
Yes.
Language like that, which obviously brings your musical background into the way you write. But could you just talk a little bit about, not the substance of the book, but the process of writing and how you sort of decided on this structure?
Yes, and actually I'll bring in one thing I failed to mention when we met earlier. I wrote the book using a musical framework, in that I think I say friends here who are musicians, normally when you are going to learn a piece, it's very difficult to learn a big piece in one day or 1 week. You break into small manageable parts. So in this book, for example, there are how many, 9 chapters or 10 of them. So I was okay, from now until 3 weeks, I'm going to just a rough draft of chapter 3, because that's what I think is in my head now. So I go work on that without focusing on any other thing. Then I'm like, as I'm writing chapter 3, ideas in chapter 6 are coming up. So I go and create a little like file where I dump some ideas which I may sort of focus on later. Because if you're learning a piece of music, especially the music of Bach and even jazz to a certain extent, things come up later. There are motifs which show up later. And what you realize is if you are struggling with one motif here, if it's a trio or some sort of big difficult chord, sometimes you know that, okay, well, that may show up in chapter 6, and let me pay attention when I get to that chapter or that area, because the same chord may come up. So I use that area. And also I was telling some colleagues earlier that sometimes I'm a big student of William Zinser, who is the writing guru in the United States. If it wasn't him, I probably also not put 2 sentences together. But William Zinser also was a great, I have never met him, but his work has influenced me. And he said, I think it was him, that because writing is so difficult for many of us, when you wake up in the morning, don't brush your teeth, don't do anything, just go and type. By then, I think if you're writing, just sit down with your pad and start putting down ideas. Now, later on, you can refine them. So that comes up in music a lot. In fact, if I'm learning a piece of music and it's very difficult, sometimes when I wake up the following day, I go to the most difficult part. And that's what they call targeted practicing, I think. So that's basically what's helpful.
Okay. Yeah. But now, just to pick up on one more aspect of this, on page 42, 43, you end one of the chapters with a coda.
Yes.
And we spoke earlier. Yes. And you told me what one of the reviewers said, peer reviewers said about the book and your use of the musical language. You want to just share that?
Yes. One thing I must qualify, peer review and can be a terrible, what's the one? All of you. And this is also actually, very quickly, the arts are very helpful, because if I'm going to play especially an organ concert, sometimes that you are playing also the room, the way I practice here and I go to Goddard Chapel, they are two different worlds. So what you do is have a friend of yours or someone, they don't have to be an organist, as long as they can tell you, oh, Patrick, that's too loud, tone it down. Because the acoustics of the room is so different. So basically, it's almost like peer reviewing what you are doing, they're helping you. But sometimes I go, Patrick, this is terrible, you didn't practice that much, or this is nonsense. If it's true, it's helpful. If it's not true, it can be devastating. But I think peer reviewing is a very good process if people are honest and like, look, Patrick, all these ideas you have here don't make any sense. Go and really just make sure you explain yourself. I think it's great, other than someone telling you, it's wonderful, great, when they really are not adding anything to improve the work. So one of our peer reviewers and blind peer review said, look, these are wonderful music. I don't understand what you mean by overture and coda. Why don't you create a glossary? So if you get the book on page 272, there's a glossary of musical terms. And the first one is coda, which in Italian means a tail. That's why at the end of the chapter, the coda shows up. It's like a tail. And what it says about the coda is a piece of music at the end of a longer piece of music, usually separate from the basic structure. So you'll find that that coda I have after, is it chapter 1 or something?
Page 42, 43, yeah. Chapter whatever.
Yes, or introduction. It's a little separate, but it's part of the work. So if that helps, those are deceptive cadence. All these things come of the finale, the fugue. So if you don't know what they mean, all I will encourage you buy the book and start with page.
So that means you learn musical terms.
You can musical terms and also learn what's happening in the book.
All right, now turning to the substance of the book. You draw on two distinct, although arguably closely related concepts of development.
Yes.
It's, in some ways, these concepts reflect a debate in development that's gone a long time. It's gone on for a long time. And so on the one hand, culture and art are seen as valuable in themselves. They contribute to the quality of life, and that is a development goal.
Yes.
The other concept is they contribute to economic growth,
yes.
GDP and whatnot.
Yes, yes.
And throughout the book, you're drawing on both of those concepts of
yes.
development.
Yes.
And maybe you could just say a little bit about why you felt it was important to have both there.
Yeah. The importance of this comes for two reasons. The first reason is that when you are talking about development things, they always, economists especially, like to ask, where is the data? Prove it to me that this is working. And as Professor Sarkus said in the introduction, we really sometimes can't quantify some of this, or the data is not there, or if iTunes or what's the other music platform has it, they may not give it to you. Spotify. For many reasons. So if you are at an institution at the World Bank trying to write a paper justifying music for Jamaica, you may have a hard time convincing policymakers because you can't find the numbers to support your argument. Or if you find them, they are quoted in newspapers, and so it takes a lot of work to really make sense of all this. But then I think actually Amartya Sen and others have argued that no, let's forget the data. What about people's quality of lives? I don't know, whenever I go, the first thing which I see people enjoying is music or the arts. People all over the world somehow, for very cheap, participate in the arts for some sort of reason. In fact, I think was it Christopher Bailey, one of our historians at Cambridge, unfortunately I think he's now passed away. He said that in some parts of West Africa, some of these cravings are part of their spiritual well-being. There's no money involved, but when they are craving, it's just not a piece of wood they are trying to make. There's a spiritual sort of well-being, and that has value. We cannot quantify it, but as I like to joke, if you have children, if your son or your daughter does something stupid, you want to punish them. So if you punish them and they made you can't tell, I don't like my child now 3.5%. Because there's no way, there's that one thing that you don't like, you can't really explain so much. So there's that concept we can't measure. But also if you look at Nigeria, and I think we talked about Nollywood earlier, because the best example, Nigeria, as we are told now, is one of the reasons why the GDP, in this instrumental terms, is high, is because they started to account for movies and the telephone industry. And as I think I explained to you, it doesn't mean that Nigerian movie makers and musicians are rich, but what they are doing is contributing to the ecosystem of economic development.
Yeah.
So those, yeah.
So let me just read a passage that you quote. It's not your own language, but it's something that you quote from Craigslist in Vancouver.
Yes.
And it sort of is a nice reflection of how the arts are often undervalued. So somebody advertised on Craigslist as follows. We are a small and casual restaurant in downtown Vancouver. We are looking for solo musicians to play in our restaurant to promote their work and sell their CD. This is not a daily job, but only for special events, which will eventually turn into a nightly event if we get a positive response. More jazz, rock, and smooth type music around the world and mixed cultural music. Are you interested in promoting your work? Please reply back ASAP. So as Patrick put it, one musician found it necessary to reply as follows. I am a musician with a big house looking for a restaurateur to promote their restaurant and to come to my house to make dinner for my friends and me. This is not a daily job, but only for special events, which will eventually turn into a nightly event if we get a positive response. More fine dining and exotic meals and mixed ethnic fusion cuisine. Are you interested in promoting your restaurant? Please reply back. Do you want to say any more about that, or is it?
Yes. So what's interesting, when you're writing a book like this, sometimes you're not in charge. That was the first chapter. On one editor, the World Bank said, no, you are going to piss off some policymakers pointing fingers so much, put that later on. So it became chapter 9. But I think, I'm like you, I think it's a wonderful way to capture what's going on. We take a lot of music for granted, and I must qualify this because the arts, of course, don't have a monopoly on creativity. Teaching, I think maybe professors, you are treated better. Yeah, but many countries, teachers, even the United States, teachers are starting to strike. Is that correct? Am I hearing that correctly? Yeah. Agriculture, one of the troubling things, young people don't want to be seen at the farm because it's dirty jobs. So it's basically, there are some professions where we don't value, and for me, I feel like this is where the arts get marginalized, because people just think, oh, you can come and entertain us. And I joke with my friends, many times when I go, I have to play for my dinner. After they buy you, say, can you play for us? I'm like, you understand I'm tired and I'm paid $300 per minute? But anyway, that's basically the concept of how we look at value. And in development, it's been terrible, because I go to Jamaica. Instead of looking at how, I want to go to Jamaica someday, not because Jamaica is struggling, or not because they have gold, but because Bob Marley. And how do I know Bob Marley? Because somehow influenced Lucky Dube. And why do I know Lucky Dube? Because Lucky Dube somehow sang freedom songs and used to come to Uganda and actually stayed at the Sheraton where I used to play and used to give me thumbs up whenever I played music. So I feel like I should go to Jamaica because of Bob Marley. And it's really to do with music. And when I go there, unless I have a friend who is putting me up, but I have to get Uber, Jamaica, I have to stay in a restaurant, someone has to do my laundry. So basically there's an interaction of economic activity, which originally was inspired by me going to see where Bob Marley was born. So I think we tend not to value this, and I argue we should do the reverse, try to put value on this.
Yeah, good. Good, thank you. So, again, back to the concept of development, how we understand development, and how you address it in this book. There are many anecdotes, many examples, a substantial amount of research you've done, in which you draw on situations from around the world. So you talk about Nashville, you talk about Newark, you talk about Paris, you talk about Kampala, you talk about Lagos, you talk about Mumbai. What underlies all of that is a notion that development is not an issue just for the so-called poor countries.
Yes.
And to me, that resonated with the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Millennium Development Goals tend to be thought of, well, these are things that the poor developing countries need to do, and we'll try to help them in the rich world. Sustainable Development Goals have a set of goals that both the poor and rich countries, and I'm using those words in quotation marks, need to meet. For example, income inequality. Some of the most unequal countries in the world are in the rich global north, or environmental, or gender and whatnot. So just sort of comment a little bit on that, because I think it says something about your notion of the creative wealth of nations. What you're suggesting is that there's pockets of wealth and pockets of creative poverty all over the world.
Yes, and again, going by the point, I did not share the creative wealth of a nation. As I said, nations, just to basically look at the broader picture. And again, I think with GDP measurement, we put ourselves in a trap because we tend to measure countries by their GDP growth. Yet there are pockets of inequality and poverty, even in the United States. As we know very well, right now we have the opioid crisis. Teachers are striking because they're not paid well. This is not something I was taught in Uganda when I was there, because we thought everything was great. Newark, New Jersey, I worked there as, right actually after Fletcher, as a consultant for digital, to see how we can promote arts education via digital technologies. And as I sent the book, trying to find a place to stay there was very difficult, because everywhere you can't live there. You'll be killed as you try to walk home. They will be shooting at you. So I actually stayed in New York and commuted, because it's not that far to come. Because Newark, New Jersey has gone through such troubling times. And this is in the United States. And right around there are billionaires and millionaires. What's wrong? And in fact, the reason why they built the Arts Center there, the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, was to try to address some of these problems. In that, we should start looking at countries also with how are the arts useful in the United States, okay? If kids are disengaged, and MIT or Andover, even Fletcher, can have all the arts they want, how about the schools in Lawrence, Massachusetts? What should we do to try to get them also have the equal access opportunities? And I'm not going to try to pick on donors, but you can easily see if I'm a millionaire, I'm more likely to give money to my alma mater, Fletcher, which is not wrong, but also Harvard will get a piece of that. But many, even in rich countries, schools which are struggling are not getting enough attention and resources. And that's, in a way, creating inequality. And many ways, the arts are the ways you can engage. In fact, I think someone has written already about this, in that we have the situations of inequality, partly because of social exclusion. In that I don't talk to him because I think where he comes from, we can't have anything in common. I'm not going to talk to him because he's down at Harvard and they're very snobbish. So there are all these things. But when you realize this, is that when you bring in things like music, they help us to connect, even within rich countries. Now, the issue of climate change, which we talked about. The United States, I think, is still the top, one of the United States and China, and the US is, if climate change is really a big problem, how are we going to address it? We are not going to start pointing fingers to poor countries. And yet, if it's true that the issues of climate change are affecting poor countries, you see how the actions, the consuming or whatever we do here is affecting people in some small countries somewhere, or even poor people in the United States. So how should we deal with this? But then in poor countries, you see the exports are always, the economies are not diversified, and yet this has been preached to death. So you find in countries like maybe Uganda or Rwanda or Egypt, their exports are really pretty much the traditional kinds of things, and we all know that oil and maybe will run out someday. We need to start looking at things in a broader way. What's very interesting, and what I benefited from the classes at Fletcher here, that trade, for example, law and development, and also the course in international relations with you, and the course also in international trade and services, is that if I go to, let's say, Jamaica to study Jamaican music, that's actually international trade. But we don't look at it that way. But is Jamaica promoting courses to get people there to go study music? I don't think so. I don't know. They do great. But that's the idea, that these countries have resources which are not really promoting, and which they could.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were just talking there about, you know, a course in trade, course in international law, course in international relations. The book is very multidisciplinary. So it's about the arts and culture.
Yes.
It's about economics, it's about law, it's about the environment, it's about health, mental health, it's about, or touches on gender.
Yes.
So a whole range of disciplines.
Yes.
Can you just comment a little bit on how your Fletcher education benefited the writing of the book, but also just your understanding of how to really understand this phenomenon? You really have to understand it from these multiple perspectives.
Yes, and actually, this is one of our strongest, Fletcher, I think one of our strongest points about the school is, if you come here, they tell you that the course is going to be interdisciplinary, you know, or multidisciplinary, whatever you want to call it, because I think, as I mentioned to you earlier, the school is trying to train people or educate people who are going to be dealing with mostly global issues, or even domestic issues which have. For example, I had mentioned to a Fletcher event, or Tufts event in Washington, that Fletcher or Tufts want to basically be more global, looking at things in a broad. I told them, you may want to be also talking to the mayor of Somerville, because what is happening in some communities, people are coming from countries and they're undocumented. And some people locally are complaining, oh, these people are coming here taking our services. What should we do with this? Or refugees. The refugee crisis is not only happening in places like Syria or around there, but these issues tend to be very global. And even if you want to look broad, you are like, locally, how is it affecting the way things are going here? So Fletcher, I think, helped me to look at, okay, I'm not going to say that I came here to be trying to be president of some country, but I think that if you're going to make policies at the World Bank, you must understand that sometimes if I'm trying to promote cultural tourism in Uganda, I just don't do it for money. How are women treated in the tourism industry? Is that helping? In many countries, women tend to be like taking care of small children. If they are being abused, how is that affecting the education of the students at home? So you see, this is a very big angle. And I'm not saying you have to be specialized in it, but you must pay attention to all these moving parts. If I want to promote intellectual property in Uganda or somewhere, okay, it may be very good, but maybe an angle that, how about people who don't have money to buy music or books or stuff? What should we do with them? Should they be a social business? And Muhammad Yunus comes in, which will help people to start some sort of businesses which are catering people who may not be able to pay for some content. And this is, you then have to know some kind of, how can we make it work in terms of business? And then public policy. I don't think the private sector has a big role, but governments, the burden, I think, of responsibility mostly falls on governments on big issues like this, immigration. In Uganda, I may say that, oh, we're exporting a lot of musicians and we want them to travel to Kenya or to the United States. And we can make sure we give them passports very quickly because they are distinguished artists. But if Kenya says, we don't want your artists to come here, you need negotiation. And these are some of the courses which I think the Fletcher School prepares you for. I think I've put in the best plug for the school. But for good reason. I think it's true that, and in my case, as I also told you earlier, I was trained as a musician. I used to practice 10 hours a day. It's not even a joke. My back is partly hurting because practicing so much. So having been trained this way so much in music, coming here to look broadly was wonderful to complement my own background.
Yeah, the breadth. All right, I'm going to ask one more question and then give the audience a chance to ask a question or two if they'd like. Just back to the origins of the book and your course and the paper you wrote with Professor Salajus, and you've already mentioned this, but just to elaborate on the concept of intellectual property and copyrights and how that relates to some of the argumentation in your book, because and it's complicated, but what you're suggesting is, on the one hand, copyright protects the artist, protects the creations of the artist. On the other hand, it can stifle creativity, it can make education difficult. So sort of reflect a little bit on your thinking about the phenomenon of copyright and how it relates to some of the themes.
Yes, I will start with, I think, a general concept which I think you and I agree, everyone will probably agree. I think Joe Stilgis and Jeffrey Sachs, I think, those people, they have been big advocates of having the open, especially patents for HIV/AIDS sort of drugs. In that, if I'm a pharmaceutical, let's say Pfizer, and I go and put in research and come up with this HIV drug, and that drug may cost about maybe even $50 or $100, $50 or even $30. Well, in a country like Uganda, many people who may have HIV or have relatives who have HIV or friends that may be a lot of money. But then Pfizer says, oh, I want to get my money back. I invested in it. Where were you living? Your government should borrow money for the World Bank to put in this. No, we are going to set the price. Well, India comes up and does a wonderful knockoff. And that's stealing patent. Is it a patent you stole now? And then there will be tensions like, no, you cannot steal our idea. Well, people are dying. And that's where the economics cannot solve these problems alone. So you have to, what should we do as human beings? If India can make a knockoff drug and it's only $5 or $10, should people die because they cannot get a cheap drug from India? I think no. People should be then allowed to access the medicine to live, because they may be even the next Einstein. They may be, even if they are sick or whatever, it's still human beings who could come up with wonderful innovations or contributions to their family, or just being human beings who can live longer. So I think then you have to look at that balance. When it comes to creative work, I say in the book I benefited. I used to, if this was a music book, especially Bach, because then were the most common, I'll go pretty much copy it by hand or photocopy it. Well, Cambridge University Press says, yeah, do not copy this book. But then I can't afford it. That's true. So, I mean, but I was learning and I needed it. And even CDs were big. By then, actually, American top 40s were a big thing. And I was playing in a hotel. And people would come to me and say, can you play Hello Dolly? I'm like, what's Hello Dolly? Just listen to the pipe music. And I go back to the hotel engineers there in the sound room, like, can you get me a copy of that? You see, that's actually copyright infringement, really. But then it helped me to really move on. But then now I am here learning. You know, when you are learning for purpose, you should allow this. But I think for professional reasons, then it's not possible, because then Cambridge needs to get the money back, or the book writers need to get their money back. So where should we draw the line? So I think that for learning purposes, for example, students should be allowed to learn. But then to a certain extent, those who can pay should pay. But ironically, sometimes a colleague at the World Bank, unfortunately, he's now passed away, he told me a disturbing story. When the World Bank, some years ago in 2000, James Wolfenson then was the president who loves the arts. And they went to, I think, Ghana and Kenya and maybe Senegal to try to promote intellectual property for development. What they realized, I think, was in Senegal, that if I'm a musician, or you're a musician in this case, and I am your producer, so you come up with a wonderful CD, we send it to the market, and it's doing very well. The way it happens, I'm like, oh, I am going to make a knockoff copy, because I'm your producer, I have the master, so the quality is actually still the same. And then if your CD is $10, I'm going to sell mine $5. In economics, of course, what a consumer is going to do, they're going to find a way to buy a $5 one, which is nice copyright. But here, the people who are buying it, it's not their fault. Well, in this case, the unethical practice came from the inside, the producer. Is the person here to point fingers. I think the law here should come into how do we sort of stop this kind of behavior.
Yeah.
So that's my rough take on these kinds of issues.
And you handle it really in an interesting way in the book, just because there are no simple answers to this question. And you, a musician who has a stake in being able to earn a living from your music, see it from both angles really well. Anybody have questions?
Yes.
Yeah. Congratulations, Mr. Kabanda.
Thank you.
For your book. I count myself lucky to know you.
Okay.
Have you considered translating that book?
Well, first of all, I should say Emmanuel Ojo and I we are teaching together at Andover. He was teaching French, is it French? And I was teaching organ, and I decided to stay. He was the smart one who stayed. So, thank you for coming all the way. Yeah, the book, the translations, I was in China in the fall. In fact, actually, Carlo Perry sitting down there, friends of his invited me to China, and China treated me like I was a king. And they've, because in China, I think Chinese is still the major language. In fact, they have the sophisticated Chinese, which is spoken in Taiwan, and then the traditional in Taiwan and Hong Kong, and then the simplified in mainland China. So the librarian there told me that they had a lot of trouble. Many parents wanted the book. You know, I had a room, maybe library also, 80 people showed up. All of them pretty much wanted the book, but they could only get about 20 English copies. And some of them, it would take them a long time because English is not their first language. Some, they can understand it, but it would be nice to have the book in Chinese. In fact, the librarian there also recommended what you call a hybrid version, where you have like the same book, but this part is English and this part is Chinese. In that if I'm reading it, if I am trying to clarify something in my own language, I can go look at Chinese. So I mean, I've already contacted Cambridge, and maybe they'll work on it. I think it will only work if Amartya Sen writes the letter. But it's definitely, this been considered, yes.
Good. Anyone else?
Yes.
Just wonder what your thoughts are on cultural exchange and how important that really how much importance that plays into this whole concept. I think, you know, sort of looking at how world music has become such a huge part of the music scene in this country, and it's really based on, you know, fusing and sharing cultures.
Yes. Yeah, so in the book, and again, thanks to my training here, I took a course on cultural diplomacy with Alan Henriksen, and actually wrote a paper. I just got an email from Professor Henriksen, and he's retired now. He's in California with his family. And he said, look, Trump and Kim are meeting now. And you know, he wrote me a paper about the New York Philharmonic going to North Korea to play concerts. You remember this? When was this? 2008 or something like that? So I'm like, why don't you revive that paper now? Because after these leaders meet, heads of state, people will still want to interact with each other. And I think the arts, pointing your question, are one of the most effective ways of how people can understand each other. So there are a couple of things I want to add on that. In this book, I mentioned something called the Culture Free Trade Agreement. And that Culture Free Trade Agreement came about because there are some musicians from Nova Scotia,
Yes, Nova Scotia.
Around Canada who are crossing the United States because they don't really need to show their pass or something to come to play in some Vermont, somewhere in Maine or Vermont for music festivals. And then one time immigration officers caught one of them and they put them in jail. Something. And this musician who was organizing this got very angry because it's like, this is culture exchange. These people are not even making that much. But you are really disrupting our entire sort of summer experience for people who come to listen to them, and even for the musicians themselves. So he created, you can't go and find it online. Is it a petition? You can sign a petition. I think you must get how many signatures you should get to have the Congress look at your case. So I don't think in this kind of climate it will work, but basically some people have gone so far to argue that we should have a culture free trade exchange where people can move freely. In the book, I specifically mention artist visas. And the reason I mention artist visas is because in many countries I go, the very virtuoso musicians playing traditional instruments would not necessarily have a bank account with $2,000 to show to the American embassy. And if they have land, it's mostly communal land, as we discussed. It's not for individual. So if they are coming to the United States, and actually Fletcher students who work in the State Department also have to follow the guidelines of the State Department, in that they can't just give them the visa because they are wonderful musicians. They can sometimes, but the paperwork is almost filling this entire room. So I propose that we should create a visa where we acknowledge, because some of these musicians, when people see them or know them, it's clear that they are virtuosos in their own right. But they never went to Juilliard, or don't have $2,000, or they don't have sponsors immediately to, and some of them don't even speak English. They need interpreters. How can we make sure that the exchange gets easy? I modeled that on the idea that in the United States, I think it's still happening even now, that we have what the so-called agriculture visas, where people during the summer or some harvest season are given visas to come pick fruit, because Americans will not want this job. I don't know how true that is, but there are agriculture visas where people can come and pick fruit, and the fruit ends up on our dining tables. And I said, well, if you can give people visas to come pick, why don't give them visas to come play music? So I feel like that should be considered. But also there are some famous musicians who are like Pitingo, I mentioned, from Spain. Now he's a very famous flamenco musician, but his name is similar to a terrorist name. So when he thought, because he's famous, he would easily get a visa. And they booked Carnegie Hall and everything was also. When we went to American embassy, they looked, what's your name, Pitingo? Oh, your name is on the fly list. Why? It's like a terrorist name. We need to do an investigation. Well, if you book Carnegie Hall and you're supposed to play tomorrow, they're not waiting. By the time they resolve the issue, maybe by Monday, they had to cancel that concert. And $25,000 were lost. The research is in the book. That's another reason to read the book. Anyway.
So art and culture are an asset for many countries, but they're also a liability for governments. We see like Ai Weiwei being persecuted by the Chinese government. In your own country, Bobby Wine.
Yes, yes.
I lived in Kenya, and this famous photojournalist sort of made a real mark on the country by documenting the post-election violence, and has now turned into a politician that the government regularly arrests very publicly. So I wonder what your take is on sort of the political role of supporting the arts, and when art becomes political.
Yeah, and actually, Professor Johnson wanted to ask this question and said maybe we should leave it out. I'm glad you've also brought it up because it's a very important concept. And I didn't dwell on it. I mentioned a little bit, as you pointed out earlier in the book, but I don't dwell on it. Now, and the other people I can look to here who have good answers, you probably will understand here. Joseph Nye has this concept of the so-called soft power. And you all know, how many people, I'm sure most of you here know about soft power. If you don't know soft power, raise your hand. Don't be shy. One person? Okay, soft power is the idea that we have hard power, which is mostly military power. I'm going to go in bomb Syria or Venezuela, let's take in the military. And soft power being like, let's take in artists and use cultural things, and can range from even educational exchanges. And I think what Joseph Nye has pointed out, that even within the framework of a military sort of sector, you are also going to have elements of soft power. And the point comes, for example, one time I asked Dana Gioia, he was the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts under George H.W. is the
First one, the older one?
The second one.
Second one is just George W.
George W. Bush. He was his chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts. I don't know where I met him, but I asked him a question. Why is it that the United States with so much money doesn't support the National Endowment? The budget is very small. He's like, Patrick, look, it's complicated. And so why is it complicated? We actually spend more money on the arts, but you know where it goes? It goes to the military. Because the US military has a huge budget for the arts, believe it or not. So that doesn't get accounted. I would never have known that answer if I did not, in that to show you that even within a military framework, you are going to have soft power influences, according to Joseph Nye. Now, politicians are very clever. If I want to conquer you, in fact, you may argue that Africa was conquered using soft power. Desmond Tutu has joked saying that when the Europeans went to Africa, they told us, let us pray. So they gave us Bibles to pray and we closed our eyes. By the time we opened our eyes, all the land was gone. so this is the issue to do with if I'm a politician, I'm going to use artists. And this has been done. It's not even a joke. For the paper I wrote for Alan Henriksen, I mentioned earlier, I went in to look in the history of culture diplomacy because it was bothering to me why it's not celebrated that much. Well, the theory is that when America was fighting Russia with a Cold War, because I think it was just America and the United States, the United States and Russia for the most part. Well, the United States decided to use culture, they will send musicians. So some scholars of culture diplomacy have said that whenever you mention culture diplomacy, they associate it with US culture war, but actually it's more broader than that. It's not I'm going in. In fact, James Wolfenson, I don't know if I say this in the book, but I interviewed him for my thesis and said the World Bank should not ever do something like, oh, we're sending young staffers at the World Bank and say, they're coming to country A and want to go see your museum and want to look at the music because you want to be involved with artists, to be friendly with them so that we can get in and do whatever we want. Now, you shouldn't use it to penetrate and get people to vote on things just because you are trying to get influence because of culture. Unfortunately, politicians tend to be politicians, and they will do whatever they can. If you don't use hard power, they can use soft power, in this case, artists. In China, of course, Ai Weiwei has been, I think, is he now allowed to go there or no? Ai Weiwei, to go back to China, or he can't go back to China now. I mean, I don't know, but I know it's not been easy for him. But you have to understand many artists, even Lucky Dube I mentioned earlier, when they are singing against apartheid, it was not easy. And the civil rights movement here, a lot of artists, we are part of the struggle, but life wasn't easy for them as well. So I think the gist and the conclusion I will end with this is that, yes, culture can also be abused and used for bad purposes as any sort of power.
And I'll cut to Jess in a minute, but when I mentioned this earlier, Patrick said that would be an entirely different book. So yes. Maybe that'll be your next one. Professor Salakis.
I've got to go off and teach, but before we go, thank you again for coming. But what are you doing next? What's your next act?
The
next suite?
It's a very complicated question, but a good question. You always ask difficult questions. The next thing I would like to do, I am going to maybe spend a little more time going around promoting this book. The reasoning is because whenever I go out, I find that people are interested in the book. But it's like, how can I say? Basically, I don't know until I'm in a place. what I've noticed that some people who was at, for example, at MIT recently, and students somehow found it because one of them had met me at an MIT Africa Business Conference, and he told his friend, his friend wants to write a thesis, and they got the book. I'm like, I'm going to use the same model, the book, but that was accidental. But then, before I know it, they want me to go there, and they bought a number of books to give their friends. And things like this happen all the time, and I don't have a secretary or an assistant yet, so I am always manually the one who has to. So if you send me an email and I don't answer quickly, it's not that I'm ignoring you. It's just the volume is too much. So I would like to spend more time on this, but that will stop. And also I would like to do more work doing a PhD, because I would like to teach, and I taught high school for some time, that I would like to engage more on the policy level. And by the way, I'm not saying this is necessary. If you work at a place like the World Bank, where as a researcher in the office of a chief economist, typically you have to have a PhD. I was one of the most unusual people to be there, and that's why they were always, what are you doing here? I was lucky that I was writing on a very unusual topic, but had I been writing on a topic on agriculture, there are many people with superb PhDs on agriculture. So basically, it will help. And also I enjoy the research. Basically, I enjoy the topic I'm writing about, and that's one thing. I don't advise anyone to do a PhD or any academic work on something they don't enjoy, because it's so grueling that you must be into it. So maybe I will try again for a PhD and see, and then maybe one day become a professor. And if I'm bored, I will just come back to Fletcher and do another book talk for another book.
Why wouldn't you come to be a professor here? The PhD would be in arts and development. That's what you're thinking. So
yeah.
you're
So
continuing this line of research.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
We have. I know that there's meant to be a. Can we take a couple more questions and that's it? Yeah.
Okay.
So we'll start here because I saw your hand. We'll go here, and that'll be it.
I think it's hard for us Americans to balance the private and public sector. We're always debating that. And Patrick, you touched on the Ministry of Culture as a possible institution to work with in developing countries. But you barely touched on it, and I wonder if you could give us your impressions from different countries, some that you visited, of how well the ministries of culture are fulfilling what you would like to see them do. I think there's debate about it, especially those of us who work in foreign aid through the World Bank or USAID. We're supposed to deal with government institutions, but is that the way we really would prefer to work? Is that, what lessons have you learned about ministries of culture and their effectiveness?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think in the United States, it's correct to say that is it the National Endowment for the Arts? Will that be the Department of Culture?
Equivalent of a Ministry of Culture?
Yeah,
I guess
no.
it probably is, right?
Yeah.
National Endowment.
Yeah.
It is National Endowment.
Except it's private, it's
Yeah.
not government.
Yeah. So what you have to understand, and from reaching this actually goes to the broader development problems we have in both developing countries. Even in the United States, cultural institutions are really not well funded. In fact, even in education, I'll argue that all these schools Fletcher, Harvard, and stuff should be free. Because even things like, education, for some extent, should be public goods. Is that the way, the terminology for it? But many cultural institutions, in fact, if you go to Lincoln Center, Kennedy Center, and so most of them are coming in, people giving public donations. I don't think they get much from public funding. So it's not fair to accurately say that the Ugandan Ministry of Culture is barely, there's no money there, because they are following a model which is really not the best model. And the military, and that's why I talk about military, is it in the military industrial complex? The military budgets tend to be way bigger than when you look at the ministries of culture. And now, the only country, and I mentioned this in the book, which I cite in the research I use on tourism, there's a book I cite on tourism, France, I think, is the only country with a serious Ministry of Culture. They actually invented the Ministry of Culture. That's the only exception, I think, from what I know, but many countries are not doing a good job. Now, what should we do? And I don't know if that I say that in the book, but I wrote to the World Bank once on a little blog, that when we invite ministers of finance to come to the World Bank for the annual meetings, we should also invite ministries of culture. I have never seen anywhere where they invite the Minister of Culture to the World Bank to come and discuss innovation and development at the World Bank with the Minister of Culture. That would be a step forward. And unfortunately, Jim Wolfenson will be the first person to tell you, former president of the World Bank, that he was so disappointed when he was president of the World Bank. Government ministers or presidents will come to him. Most of the time, they are trying to ask for money to build a dam, or they want to oil refinery. And he will tell them, by the way, tell me about your culture. They will not talk about it unless you're a famous Hollywood star and they want to be proud to talk about you. But normally the culture is the last thing on their mind because it's not serious. They always talk about these big hard things, infrastructure, and not realizing that all these things go together. So I think that, for example, if you come to Fletcher here and you are going to work with the Ministry of Culture, you're going to understand you need to take a course in marketing with Professor Bernadette, which is nation branding. That's the domain of the Ministry of Culture, okay, which is really to do with development. You're going to take a course in international relations. You want to really negotiate with other countries. How are you going to have your culture exchanges? The Ministry of Culture has a part in this. And one thing, this is more on a business, maybe Professor Tanat here can understand this when I talk about this, is that when you go to get funding for the Ministry of Culture, I'm not saying we should not renovate our museums and many culture things and recognize artists. But also, they are not going to give grants to small, medium enterprises in the domain of creative work. For example, women, Professor Truckman was telling me in Rwanda, some of them have cooperatives or some small-scale industries making baskets. Where are they getting funding from? Who is really seriously taking their work, marketing it abroad? That should be the Ministry of Culture. Are governments paying attention? I don't know. And I think that should change. Yes.
We're going to have to go here. One final question, quick answer, and then we got to...
I will get an exception for Ugandan guy there, so 2 more maybe.
All right, okay. 2 quick questions and 2 quick... Let's start here, yeah.
Thank you so much for your inspiration.
Yeah.
And you ended the book by saying imagination and choice. And I was wondering, what is your vision in terms of the integrity of arts and prosperity, and in terms of the sustainable development goals?
Yes.
What is your take on that, and how do you see it?
Yeah, well,
Hard to give a quick answer to that question.
It's a very broad answer. It's a very good question. I don't know how I can make it because making it short is very difficult. But let me try. The first thing to do with that, why that chapter became imagination and choices, there's a professor here called Miguel Bazneth, who was the American ambassador to the Mexican ambassador
to the U.S.
To the U.S. when I was just left Fletcher to go work at the World Bank. And I took a course with him on culture and values, I think something like that. And he told me, Patrick, you know, whenever you want to do something, imagine what you want and then go create it. Okay? It's not that I've found the data for the most part. If you look at the things which MLK thinks, they have observed something like, what society do we want? Hence these big speeches, I have a dream, which may be like theoretical concepts, but you have seen what they've done with power. Someone imagine what kind of society do you want to be. I think the arts are very powerful to helping us really tackle difficult problems. Because most of the times you're dealing with ambiguity and you don't know whether the mutations you work out nicely, but you have this belief that let me give it a try. Instead of being climate change and sustainable development goals, or just really much dealing with issues of the so-called sustainable development. The reason I say so-called is because some people feel like, what do you mean by sustainable? And that question, I'm sure it didn't come. But let's assume we are looking at, okay, how can we make progress without compromising resources for those who come after us, or without depleting the environment? Most of the times the arts are very good at really, if you look at minimalism or play the music of Bach, many artistic domains are very good at getting one subject and finding many ways to reuse the same thing. So for example, if I finish this bottle, instead of throwing it there as trash, what do I find to use for it? On a big scale, if we are looking at reusing things, how are we really dealing with waste? And I think many of these things come through design of theirs. There are many artists who have done things from scrap, you not even believe it was trash. One of them is the orchestra in Paraguay, where kids made instruments from trash. Oh, yeah. And these are some of the concepts. I will stop there. Okay, Ugandan guy.
Thank you so much for giving me the exception. I want to pick up on a question. Robert Chagulanyi has managed to communicate to 3/4 of the population of Uganda by music, using the music. What would, and I've just seen a chapter in your book, I haven't read the whole book, which talks about creative data collection.
Yes.
Given what Robert Chagulanyi has managed to do in a short time using music, I wonder what your thoughts would be on creative data collection that can help advance Uganda from where it is to a better place in relation to the title of the book, Creative Wealth for Uganda.
Yeah, it's a difficult question which I don't know if I understand, but let me paraphrase. You're asking me, how can we get to collect data in Uganda to promote the creative wealth of nations? Is that, or creativity in Uganda?
Yeah, in a model similar to how Robert has managed to tap into 3/4 of the population of Uganda.
So now the very interesting thing is that your question has an answer embedded in it. Someone went and counted how many people have been able to be influenced by Chagulanyi's music. How did they, what methodology did they use? Did they use Facebook posts or likes or whatever it is? Did they use Google data? Did they do surveys and stuff?
I am a health demographer.
Yes.
And 3/4 of the population of Uganda are youth. And this is the group which Robert Chagulanyi has managed to move.
Yes.
He has created himself a very big movement by using music to communicate with the youth.
Yeah, so I think that by the fact that we know the numbers of those young people, we know that someone went and did research and collected the figures which we are using. But I think getting the other side of the issue is that sometimes when you have a powerful voice, Robert Chagulanyi in this case as an example, they themselves can be the agent. They don't need to be like, oh, if I sing this kind of music, data from somewhere is showing me that I'm going to reach a certain number of people. They know that their music is powerful or it's being proved somehow, and they're able to reach people because they are famous in their ways or their music is effective that way. And unfortunately, going to that question here, some politician may be like, we need to silence this guy, or if I want to really get them to be on my political side, let me also find a musician who is going to find the counter example. Is that helpful? Okay.
So, Patrick, right? For anybody who wants to learn what a deceptive cadence is, or many, many other things, I strongly recommend that you buy this book, but because it's so educational, Patrick will probably allow you to steal this book as well. But thank you so much for this really enriching discussion, and it's a wonderful book. I read it in one sitting and I loved it. So thank you, Patrick.
Thank you so much.